So let's talk about decimals again. Let's review what we have learned about decimals over the last 2 days. We are still talking about place value. Decimals fall under that category for us too. We're talking about the place value of decimals, understanding how they relate to each other, relate to the rest of our place values, also how decimals relate to money. A few quick reminders before we begin. Place value. When I say place value, we're talking about the value of a digit based on its location in a number. So if I specifically ask, for example, for the value of the 5 in that number in this picture, that 5 is in the 10 millions place, right? It says tens, but that's in the millions house. So if it's in the 10 millions place and we have a digit of 5 there, that means that 5 has a value of 10 million. And we know that because of our place value system. So now let's talk about decimals, because place value, before we started with decimals, was all about whole numbers. Well, tenths and hundredths are our decimal place values, both of which are smaller than 1. They are smaller than whole numbers. They're parts of a whole number. For example, this model right here. By model, I mean this square, this representation on screen. There is only one shaded in, but this model is split into 10 columns. If you want to count them, you can, but I promise there's 10 there. If we only have one of those 10 pieces, we have 1/10. As a fraction, that's 1 over 10, but we'll get to that in a later unit. As a decimal, that's 0, decimal point, 1, because we have one of the 10 pieces here. If we had all 10, it would be equal to 1 whole, or a 1 in the ones place. Now let's think about hundredths. Hundredths are the second place value to the right of a decimal point. And imagine again, this model on screen represents one whole number, a 1 in the ones place. We only have one of these tiny squares shaded in. So there are 100 squares in this grid representing hundredths. We only have one of them. So as a fraction, that's 1 over 100, but again, we'll get to fractions later. As a decimal, that is 0, decimal point, 0.01. It takes 100 hundredths to equal 1, or a 1 in the ones place. So let's kind of look at this example. So what is a decimal? Decimal place values are smaller than 1. The tenths place is the first spot to the right of the decimal point. So when I say decimal point, I'm talking about that dot, that period, this black circle that's representing it here on screen. That's our decimal point. Whole numbers are to the left. For example, that 0 is in the ones place. We don't have any whole numbers. There's nothing in the tens place, but that's our normal place value that we're familiar with. To the right of a decimal point, though, that's where the numbers become parts of one whole. So I have a 2 in the tenths place and an 8 in the hundredths place right now. That number, read out loud, would be 28 hundredths. So, again, the tenths place is the first spot to the right of the decimal point. It takes 10 tenths to equal 1 whole, or 1. The hundredths place, where that 8 is the second spot to the right of the decimal point. It's that second place value after the decimal point. It takes 100 hundredths to equal 1 whole, or a 1 in the ones place. Now, hundredths, for example, this grid to the right, we have 28 of them, right? So there are 2 full columns. If you remember from the tenths model, a full column, a vertical column there, is a tenth. That's why there are 2 shaded in, 2 full columns, and there's a 2 in the tenths place. There's also an 8 in the hundredths because we have 8 more in that third column. Together it's 28 hundredths, but you could also think of that as 2 tenths and 8 hundredths together. So let's kind of see this in action, these decimal numbers equaling 1. This is what I mean by decimals being smaller than 1. Over here on the left, these are tenths, right? I've got numbers in that first spot right after those decimal points. That's not a comma, that's a decimal point. So zeros to the left, that's just a placeholder. There's no whole numbers yet, right? So I'm starting at 1/10. I'm going to add another tenth, 2 tenths, then 3 tenths, then 4 tenths, then 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and if I add one more, that becomes 10 tenths, right? But you know from basic addition, once we get to 9 and we get to 10, it moves up a place value, right? It gets bigger. So it becomes 1 whole. 10 tenths is equal to 1. Same for hundredths, but it takes 100 of them to make one whole number, right? So to save me time, instead of typing 100 of these, I started at 90 hundredths. So let's imagine we have 90 hundredths. I'm going to add another one, 91, 92, 93 hundredths, 94 hundredths, 95 hundredths, 96 hundredths, 97 hundredths, 98 hundredths, 99 hundredths, and then 1, right? If I add one more to 99 as a whole number, it would become 100, so that place value is moving up. I just have 1. I don't have a decimal at that point. You could imagine it's still there. You could say decimal point 00 after. Doesn't change the value because of that decimal point. I know that 1 is still in the ones place. It's 1. Let's move along to another example we looked at yesterday. Again, this is 28 hundredths as a decimal. We have a model to the right representing that. Also money. We talked about how money relates to decimals. So look carefully at that place value chart above that contains decimals. This is not all whole numbers. It's a very simple mistake to make. You see a number that has 4 digits, for example, and you think, oh, well, that must be thousands. But if we have a decimal point, they're not all whole numbers, are they? On the left, I have ones and tens. On the right over here, I have tenths and hundredths. Those are decimals, smaller than 1. Also take note of the 3 ways on screen to represent the same value, right? We talked about that today, learning different ways to represent a number. As just a decimal number, we could say this is 28 hundredths. If I represented it as a model, I've got this hundreds grid over here with 28 squares shaded in. Also, that represents 28 hundredths. And then I have change, right? We talked about money today. A quarter is worth 25 cents. Pennies are worth 1 cent each, or 1/100th. Together, this is 25, 26, 27, 28 cents, right? If you've ever seen a price tag with cents on it, that decimal point comes first, then you have numbers after. This 28 cents is written just like this, 28 hundredths, with a decimal point in front of that too. Here's a place value chart with money to help us understand that relationship with decimals and whole numbers and money. So for example, a $1 bill would be in the ones place because that's one whole, you have $1. $10 bill would be in the tens place, right? $10. A $100 bill, if you have 100, you've got a 1 in the hundreds place, right? So look at this decimal point. We only go up to hundreds over here, not thousands or 10,000s, because those first 3 place values on the left are whole numbers. Then we have our decimal point, so to the right are smaller than $1. There's a dime representing tenths place, and a penny representing the hundredths place. A dime is worth 10 cents, so that would be decimal point 10, just like a tenth. In the hundredths place, we have that penny, which is worth 1 cent. It would be written as 0 decimal point 01 because it's 1/100th. Also relating our decimals and how we can get to 1, or that these are part of one whole. If $1 is made up of 100 cents, or you could say that as 100 pennies or 100 cents equal $1, if I had 100 pennies, they wouldn't be a decimal point anymore, right? Altogether, they equal $1. Same with dimes, they're worth 10 cents. If I have 10 of them, then I have 100 cents, which is worth $1. So we had this example in our previous lesson also, but if this all seems like too much info at once, let's focus on this one example about relating money to decimals. On screen, the pictures of our money and change here. I've got a $5 bill, I've got a quarter, which is 25 cents, a nickel, which is 5 cents, a dime, which is 10 cents, and a penny, which is 1 cent. So together, that is $5.41. So money and decimal numbers are written almost the exact same way. The only difference is when you are talking about money or writing or typing amounts that are money, we usually have that money symbol in the front of it. That's the only difference. The numbers and decimal point are still the same. So $5.41 in money. As a decimal, we could just write 5 decimal point 41, which is the same as 5 and 41 hundredths, so 5 whole, 5 ones, and 41 cents, 41 hundredths.